Okay. Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get on started. There's not a whole lot to talk about this evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So this is going to be episode 83 of Tech Thursdays. So we've been doing this show every Thursday for about a year, I think, and a half now. It's been a while since we started this. If you're new to the channel, if you're unfamiliar with what this is, we talk about anything related to PC DIY. So whether that's building a gaming PC, building a workstation, a high-end desktop, etc., anything in that realm that relates to the desktop PC space. Sometimes we talk about laptops, sometimes we talk about servers, but anything that's going to be about CPUs, motherboards, RAM, GPUs, cases, whatever. That's what we do. And then if we don't have anything to talk about, we usually just talk about games, video games. So that's kind of the adjacent topic. So this week, there's not a whole lot to talk about besides the official announcement for the X3D. So the 9800 X3D is coming out a week from today. As you guys can see on the screen, it was officially announced by AMD a few days ago, I believe, or maybe a week ago. And then now they actually have the official announcement. No, we will be talking about paint. We'll do paint. I don't have much to talk about, so we're going to talk about this, and then I guess we'll talk about motherboard block diagrams. But the only thing really that stood out to me, as somebody who got the recent Intel Core Ultra, you can see it right here, and we did a build video on it. I don't know where the Intel Core Ultra 9 is, because it feels like a paper launch. I don't know what happened, but I don't know where it is. So we're going to switch gears and talk about AMD, because I don't know what happened to the Intel CPU. I was originally supposed to get the Intel Ultra 9, but it never showed up. So it's like we got the Ultra 7 instead, and all the content is on that one. But X3D is coming out next week, so we will be talking about that. For workstation or power users, I still recommend the 9950X. We're currently streaming on a 9950X system, the one that I built a month ago now. If you guys watched that live stream where we were using the Asus X870E Crosshair Hero, that is literally the system that we're streaming on right now. So that is the main system. But for gaming, we are going to be taking a look at the upcoming 9800 X3D. It's going to be 8-core, 16-thread, with 104 megabytes of cache. Set to release a week from today, and the retail price is going to be $749. Interestingly enough, the 9800 X3D is launching on the exact same day as the...
Learned so much through your paint. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, we are going to be talking about, we're going to be doing stuff in paint later this stream. So if you do want to see paint, if you guys have questions on motherboards specifically, because I've gotten a lot of questions on motherboards in the last several weeks, particular motherboards that we will be exploring in paint. We're going to be looking at the block diagrams later, because there's really nothing more to talk about on the CPU front besides the 9800 X3D. The 9800 X3D is launching the exact same day as the PlayStation 5 Pro. So from a tech news perspective, expect to see a lot of on the PlayStation 5 Pro, but then also the 9800 X3D. So it's like if you're going console, the PS5 Pro is going to be a really, really nice console. And then if you're going PC, the 9800 X3D is probably going to be the best choice if you're someone who is looking to upgrade and you don't already have a previous generation X3D, like a 7800 X3D, for example, or the 5800 X3D. So we'll be looking at that later. Yeah, you can't wait for 9800 X3D. Yeah, man. The CPU launches in the last few months are a little underwhelming. So as somebody who has been using Zen 5, so the Ryzen 9000 series, since it launched a few months ago, I actually really like the CPU. So the 9950X is very good for multi-thread and it has the fastest single thread performance out of all of AMD's current CPUs. You can do pretty much everything with it. So it's like, this is kind of the one that I'm using. I know that the X3D is going to be faster in gaming, but, you know, the 9950X is no slouch, and you can overclock it. That being said, speaking of overclocking, the 9800 X3D is going to be very interesting to overclock because it's the first X3D chip that is fully unlocked for overclocking, which means you can, everything that you can do to a standard 9700X, like this one here, you can do the exact same thing to the 9800 X3D. So that means BCLK overclocking if the motherboard supports that, or curve optimizer, curve shaper, positive voltage offset, negative voltage offset in both directions. It supports both. And then the PBO, the full gamut of settings, should be available. So we're going to take a look at that when it comes out. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how that works. Let's see. I guess, is there anything in this article worth pointing out? AM5 plug and play. Okay, so the one thing on this, I think you need to be on the latest BIOS. It says plug and play, which is true, but if you're someone who already has an AM5 motherboard, in fact, if you're someone who's looking at buying a new motherboard to pair with this CPU, you may need to update the BIOS. I don't know if I'm not sure if the X870E, so for example, if we just pull up one of these, for instance, the X870E AORUS XTREME AI top, this is Gigabyte's highest end motherboard for the consumer desktop space. If we look at this one, we go to the support page, downloads, let's see. So, okay, so this BIOS, the latest BIOS as of October 16th, has support for the next generation Ryzen X3D CPU performance optimized, and it also has an X3D turbo mode. That's something that Gigabyte has been talking about recently. I don't know if this first BIOS, which is probably the one that ships in the box with the motherboard from the factory, I don't know if this supports the X3D. They don't have... This motherboard's probably a bad example because it doesn't actually have the full stuff listed. Like, I don't see the CPU support page. I see memory support. I don't see the CPU support. So this is probably not the best example, but that is one that is probably going to be super high end. This is another one that does not have lane sharing, by the way. This one does have an X8 slot, though. So if you wanted to run AI heavy workloads and run multi-GPU, we're talking like double GPUs in here, you could do that with this motherboard. But anyway, that's kind of sidetracked there. So let's see. Plug and play. But just make sure that you're on the latest BIOS. I think all of the motherboards at this point now have the BIOS that supports the CPU. Although you probably have to update to it. I know I updated mine today. I had to update the BIOS on like 2 of my motherboards. The ASRock board as well as the not the Gigabyte. That one I already updated a while ago. The Asus board. So I'm ready for next week, so it's like I don't have to do anything. But if you're someone who's thinking of buying the new 9800 X3D, do be aware that you're probably going to have to update the BIOS, even if you buy a brand new motherboard from the store, like Micro Center, for example, or if you're buying off of Newegg or wherever, you're probably going to have to use BIOS flashback if you don't have an older AM5 CPU. Yeah, so they actually have a lot of info on this. So compared to the existing gaming champion, so compared to the 7800 X3 and the 7950, this is a 7950 X3D, but compared to the previous X3D, they're claiming, up to, 26%, so the average... If we look at the average, the average is around 12% or so. Somewhere they say 8% based off of 40 games. So from this chart, it looks like the average is 12. But over 40 plus games they tested. They tested 40 plus games. That's a lot. That's a large sample size. They're saying 8% faster across like 45 games or whatever the total number was. So that is, considering the fact that the 7800X3D is currently the fastest gaming CPU, and this is on average 8%, almost 10% on top of that. Besides that, so you can also, remember, you can also overclock the 9800X3D in ways that you cannot overclock the 7800X3D. So I'm going to go ahead and say 10% faster. It's about 10% faster than the 7800X3D in like 40 plus games. So that is pretty good considering how much weaker everything else is in gaming compared to the 7800X3D. So the margin's even wider if you look at other CPUs. Speaking of other CPUs, they do have some results compared to the Intel Core Ultra series desktop CPUs. So these are the ones from Intel that just launched last week. I have like a whole build video on this one and all that stuff. I've been testing it recently for like a week now. And so they're saying 20% average gaming uplift going from a new Intel flagship to the 9800X3D. So that is pretty good because that's a large sample size. And on top of that, you got to remember, like, this, for anybody who's on an older computer, so like a 4-year-old computer, 5-year-old computer, 7-year-old computer, anyone who's on one of those machines, the uplift will be substantial. Because this is like the latest Intel CPU is 20%. This is 20% faster than the latest and greatest CPU. So imagine if you're comparing to like a 5-year-old CPU. You know, so, you know, that's pretty good. Look at Warhammer, which is super popular. Warhammer, yeah, 40K, Space Marines 2. I still need to finish that game, story mode. Yeah, that 42% faster than the Core Ultra 9. So, I may not agree with them testing with a Core Ultra 9. I feel like they should have tested with a Core Ultra 7. Core Ultra 9 is a different category of product. The price is like way, way higher. That's like a $650 CPU. So I don't like how they tested that, but whatever. It's just kind of like, okay, it's, yeah, whatever. It's faster than it, so it doesn't really matter, but still. And you can tell here, like some of these games, like Black Myth Wukong is literally a GPU benchmark. It is a GPU-bound game, and it's 1% faster in a GPU-bound game. Not a CPU-bound game, a GPU-bound game. That's hilarious. Avatar or the Frontiers of Pandora. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is a game that came out almost a year ago now. That game is also very GPU-bound, and this is 6% faster in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. That is a very nice-looking game, too, by the way. Ashes of the Singularity, I don't even know why is that here. That's a benchmark, last I checked. That isn't even a game. That's a benchmark that includes a game. Hogwarts Legacy, 26% faster in Hogwarts Legacy, 28% faster in Counter-Strike 2, 31% faster in Starfield, 31% faster in Hitman 3. But here's where things get kind of like, whoa, this is insane crazy. So Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. This one is probably one of the most important ones to show. This along with Warhammer and Cyberpunk, because though, and I guess Counter-Strike 2, even though it's such an old game, that's an esports game though. And a lot of people play Counter-Strike 2. Like, that's always one of the top 5 peak concurrent games played on Steam. So Counter-Strike 2, it's very good that they included that in here. It's almost 30% faster in Counter-Strike 2. But I want to draw your attention to the ones that are up here. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is the latest MMO from Square Enix. This is a very popular MMO. I myself probably have maybe 2,000 or more hours in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. So this is one that literally means something to me when I see this one. And it's 41% faster in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. Now, I actually want to go back and look at, do they have the result? Okay, so 6% faster than the current X3D in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. And the reason why that one is like one of the most important ones to look at is because Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO. It is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. This game can be, especially in the large cities, can be very CPU bound. If you're someone like me that plays on a heavily populated server with lots of players logged in all the time in the large cities, aka Limsa Lominsa at the Aetheryte, if you know exactly what I'm talking about, shout out to the Limsa Lominsa people that just hang out there with nothing better to do all day. But that sort of environment is where you will witness a CPU bound scenario. Guaranteed. And the fact that this is 41% faster than the latest Intel Ultra 9 is very impressive. And then Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, same uplift, 42%. That's huge. Call of Duty Black Ops 6. This game just came out. There's a lot of people playing this game. It's very popular right now. It's the latest COD. 47, that's almost 50% faster. That's really good. These are really good results. Cyberpunk 2077, almost 60%. I like numbers that are divisible by 5. So I'm going to call that 60%. We're going to call Black Ops 45%. But those are some big gains. What was the difference here? Call of Duty Black Ops 6, 11% faster than the 7800X3D. Hogwarts Legacy, 26% faster. And the same percentage here. Wow, yeah, this is actually pretty good. Wow. What are you guys saying? So 7800 is up to 70 what? Both 7800X3D and 9800X3D have 120 watt TDP. Okay. 9800 not what? Okay, yeah, so the new thing about the cache. Let's talk about that. Now we can use paint. So it's paint time. So let's talk about the 7800X3D. The 7800X3D is designed in such a way where you have the base silicon structure. This is like the base block. So imagine you're looking at it where you're looking at the CPU on its side, flat. Actually, hold on. How should we do this? Oh, that's like a really old CPU. Well, all right, hold up. Is it easier to open this one or is it easier to open this one? All right, so what's in here? What do we have in here? There's a CPU in here. There's a CPU right here. This is a... Well, okay, that's not in focus. Let me open it up. Okay, this is a... If it'll focus. Please focus. This is a 7950X3D. 7950X3D. This is one of the best gaming CPUs. This is like the second best gaming CPU. So the 7950X3D, imagine, so in paint, we're going to draw it where it's like this. So it's flat. So we're looking at it from a cross section on its side. So what I've drawn is the green colored PCB. It's like the tiny little PCB. Let's just draw it like this, or like this. So then we have the interposer layer. And then we have the IO die. Did I give myself enough room? Let's just say we have the IO die here. And then we have the CCD. with the cores. And then we have the V cache. I'm going to put that in orange. The cache. The L3. Stacked on top of it. Like a skyscraper. So it's like this. So you have 3D cache. And then underneath it, you have the cores. And then over here, this big thing over here is the I/O die. This is how it works for the 7800 X3D, the 7900 X3D, the 7950 X3D, and the 50, well, not the, yeah, the 5800 X3D. That's, yeah, for all of them. All of the X3D CPUs up until the 9000 series, all of them work this way. Now, what they have done differently with the 9800 X3D is they have innovated in a way that has never been possible before. The only way they've been able to do this change is due to the fact that they have changed the power gating and the power delivery for the packaging for the Zen 5 architecture. That's how they're able to do it. So, and I had hypothesized about this back in the summer of this year. In one of the live streams, we talked about different ways of getting a better result for CPUs. And one of them that I had talked about was, I mentioned briefly, they could either put the 3D like to the side of the CCD. So what that would look like is, so you still have your interposer, and then you still have your I/O die. That didn't change. And you still have the CCD. But what I said in the summer was they could do something like this, and then they would put the cache like next to it. Or something like that. Say like side by side. That way, the heat wouldn't get trapped. The cores would not be sandwiched between the interposer and the 3D cache. But instead what they did, I also said they probably could put it like in the interposer. I think I said something like they could probably put it down in here somewhere, bury it under in the interposer, and just have silicon vias that connect to it. But they didn't. They did something similar. They didn't do that exactly. Instead what they did was they actually put it upside down. So now the cache is directly connected to the interposer, and then you have the CCD with the core complex stacked on top of it. So there's a couple of advantages of doing it this way. One is you have to remember the IHS, we'll draw that in brown, I guess. So the IHS normally goes on top of it. Like this. That's this thing. The big Spider-Man looking silver thing that goes on top of the CPU. That's the thing in brown. So that's the thing that goes up there. Now, you do that on here as well. But now, the thing is, when you put it like this, the heat from the CCD, from this, gets really hot. And the heat has to radiate, it has to traverse through the V cache to get to the IHS, and then the giant air cooler or whatever, the water cooler, like the heat pipe thing, the big Noctua is sitting on top of this with the heat pipes. So the problem with 7800 X3D and all the current ones is it's hard to get the heat away from the cores because the 3D V cache is in the way. It's literally blocking the heat transfer. It's impeding the heat from getting out of the CPU in an efficient manner. Majestic Sloth just subscribed. Thanks for the sub. So anyway, that's one way of doing it. The other way is by putting it upside down, like they've done with the 9800 X3D. Now, you can put the IHS here, and now the heat transfers directly to the IHS from the CCD. It no longer has to traverse through the cache. The cache doesn't heat up as much as the cores, because the cores are what's running all the power and running it very, very high. Oh, you know what? How come you guys aren't seeing the paint thing? What happened? Oh, there we go. I don't know what happened there. Anyway, yeah, so this is the difference. The main difference is by flipping it upside down, now they no longer have this heat transfer problem or challenge that they had with the previous X3D. And this is the reason why the overclocking capabilities are vastly improved on the 9800 X3D, because they no longer have a problem with heat transfer. So this is going to be very good. This is very good news for anybody who wants to overclock the CPU. Eric Chan just subscribed. Thanks for the sub. Much appreciated. Welcome to the channel. So the bottom line is that not only is the 9800 X3D going to be able to do about 10% faster in gaming at stock, so stock for stock, you're looking at 8 to 10% improvement over 7800 X3D. On top of that, you have overclocking now. You have full overclocking. And as somebody who has been playing around with overclocking Zen 5, I can tell you guys that there is way more margin for overclocking on the new Ryzen 9000. Regardless of whether we're talking of 3D V-Cache or not, the fact is these CPUs use less power at stock than the Zen 4 CPUs, and they don't run as hot as a result of that. So you have more overclocking headroom with the 9000 series versus the 7000 series. And that is the reason why this is probably going to be one of the most popular CPUs, at least for gaming, for a very long time, because it's going to bring back the glory days of overclocking. Maybe not the full glory days of overclocking where, you could take, like any random CPU you buy and you could add like 500 megahertz to it just easily. Maybe not that, but at the very least, you now have the ability to overclock in all the different methods that were not available to X3D in the past. So I think that's going to make this a really fun CPU to play around with. Especially if you're an enthusiast and you like that sort of thing. If you like putting like giant cooling, liquid cooling on your CPU, we're talking like 420 millimeter AIO or custom loop. I think that this is a CPU that can benefit from that kind of overclock headroom due to very high-end cooling. So that remains to be seen, but I believe it's possible because I'm somebody who has been overclocking a 9950X, which is a dual CCD Zen 5 part, and that is really fun and relatively easy to overclock with a standard Noctua NHD15 air cooler. So, am I talking about you? No, I'm just talking about anyone out there who has high-end liquid cooling, like 360 millimeters, like minimum for what I consider high-end liquid cooling, but that's like barely even considered high-end. Kiev just subscribed. Thanks for the sub, Kiev. You noticed lowering SoC voltage lowered the idle time. Yeah, that's the other thing too, is the memory too. So, but here's the thing, guys. I've been testing a bunch of different motherboards in the past month, and up until this past month, I always assumed that running 8000 DDR5 was relatively easy. It's actually way more dependent on the motherboard than I initially thought, because I've been testing a bunch of motherboards, and if you're somebody who is interested in running your RAM at DDR5 8000, my recommendation is to get a X870E motherboard, not an X870 motherboard. Case in point, the MSI X870 Tomahawk that I've been testing cannot, at least the one that I have, or I've been testing, cannot do 8000 stable. I've been having a hard time getting it to run stable. I tried the 8700G, which had a better memory controller. That didn't help. It's definitely a board limitation. So I don't recommend, at this point in time, I do not recommend any X870 motherboard if you want to run very high speed RAM. Definitely go for an 8-layer PCB X870E. So like a Tai Chi or a Nova or a Carbon or a Hero or something in that class, or an Aorus Master. Like, those are the motherboards that I would recommend, because in the past, I was running 8000 on like a bunch of X670E boards, no problem. It hasn't been since testing X870, which is a lower end chipset, it's more like a B650E, that I'm a little bit more convinced that, yeah, if you want to run 8000 DDR5, you need to have a very good motherboard, because the motherboard is what matters when you want to run the RAM at high speed on Ryzen. So that leads us into the next discussion. So, memory. So DDR5. DDR5 limiting factors. Let's discuss this. For DDR5 6000, the memory controller, also known as the IMC or UMC, this is one of the most important determining factors. Or I guess we'll say DDR5 6000 or 6400, 1-to-1, the memory controller is going to be the primary limiting factor for being able to do this. Well, we shouldn't even say 6000, because that's... well, we'll just leave it there, because all the CPUs can do 6000. But 6400 specifically, 1-1, the memory controller is extremely important. Fabric also matters somewhat, but not really. Fabric kind of matters. Kind of. For the one... what is it, like... DDR5 divided by 3 ratio. We'll just say that. So that is for Gear 1, also known as the 1-to-1 ratio. Now, for the alternative scenario, for DDR5 8000, also known as 2-to-1, the number one limiting factor for DDR5 8000 is going to be the motherboard. This assumes that the memory can do DDR5 8000, but I guess what I'll say for number 2, the second limiting factor will be the actual memory. The memory itself. Can it actually do 8000? Now, this will not be a factor if you literally buy a memory kit that is rated for 8000. But if you're trying to cheap out and trying to buy like a 7200 kit or a 7600 kit or whatever, and you're going to try to overclock it to get it to 8000, then it becomes a factor, and it's like the second most important factor. But the motherboard is definitely going to be the number one priority for somebody who is wanting to run DDR5 8000. I myself will probably be building the 9800 X3D with DDR5 8000, because why not? So that is exactly what we're going to do for the utmost performance. The other thing too is this doesn't require a lot of VSOC. So the pros of I guess let's do pros and cons now of we're gonna have to delete some of this stuff. Well, we'll just put like this. Pros of DDR5 8000. Low VSOC. Low idle power. Those are the pros. The cons. need a high-end motherboard. Uh, 8,000 kit is expensive. Those are the cons. So that's what, and I know I'm kind of in the way on that, but anyway, you guys get the idea. So that is, so we'll just say this is for DDR5 8000, and then this is for DDR5 6000, and then the pros and cons for DDR5 6000. The pros, easy, oh no, okay, works on cheap, well, I won't say cheap, we'll just say works on any motherboard. Works on any motherboard. The motherboard's not a determining factor. You can use a 6-layer motherboard, it'll work. No problem. The cheaper memory. Cons. High VSOC. High idle power. So basically, the complete opposite of running your RAM at 8000. The heavy burden is on the CPU. That is why it has higher idle power, because the VSOC is running at a higher voltage. So that is... What are we saying? Will RAM memory split with it? Ideally, you do not want to do that. You can do that. It's not a good idea. I don't recommend that. Ideally, you want the same amount per channel. You don't want different amounts on different channels. You can. Windows can interleave memory. It's smart enough to interleave memory, but you're going to end up in a scenario where the Windows scheduler wants to use one channel more than the other, so you're not going to get exact load balancing for applications, if that makes sense. So it's not ideal. Let's just say that. It's not ideal. 4K X3D doesn't really benefit you. I have 5800X, worth it to upgrade to the... Yeah, I would say yes. So the 5800X is still a decent CPU. It's a 4-year-old CPU at this point. But yeah, regardless, the 9800 XT is going to be faster in everything at this point. It's just so much newer. It's going to be faster in productivity. It's going to be faster. It's going to be faster in everything. Let's just put it that way. So yeah, 8,000 is expensive, but it's, you know, it's better. It's better, but it's... oh, the other thing I'll say on this... you know, there's another good point here. Another con for 8,000. I guess another pro. Pro for 6,000 can handle or large amounts. Large amounts. You know, large. Thanks for the super chat. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, if you want to super chat the question and you want me to answer it in depth, technical discussion, we can do that too. But yeah, so if I was on AM4, because you're on a 5800X, if I was on a 5800X, I would definitely consider upgrading to the 9800X 3D. That's because, you know why? Because you've gotten 4 years, assuming you got the 5800X 3D and it was brand new at launch, which would have been in the middle of the pandemic, in the year of 2020, when everybody was trying to buy a PlayStation 5, 4 years ago, everyone was trying to buy PS5, Xbox Series X, RTX 3080, RTX 3090. It was happening. It was this time of year, 4 years ago. Oh, did I say RTX 4090? I meant, no, yeah, 3080, 3090, yeah, 30 series. And then RDNA 2. So 6800 XT, 6800, which was a unicorn. You never saw it. It doesn't exist. It was always scalped. Everything was being scalped 4 years ago. And that was when Zen 3 launched, aka Ryzen 5000, was new during the pandemic era. It was known as the beginning of the dark times in the tech history, in the tech world. We've talked about the dark times. The dark times began sometime in around Q3, the end of Q3 of 2020. So do we want to do the dark times graph or the timeline? We have 2019. We have 2020. This is like bonus paint right here. Like, I wasn't expecting to do the timeline. 2022. Man, we're starting to get too much stuff on the board, though. I'm gonna have to wipe some of this stuff out. 2024. That's where we are now. And then we have next year. We all know what's coming out next year. There's a lot of stuff. But anyway, so here we had Zen 2, PCIe 4.0, 5700 XT. That was 2019. Then we had 2020. 2020 had... Yeah, I really need to delete this 70. This stuff is in the way. But what? Here, just let's do this. There. We'll just do that. And pretend that it's not there. We had Zen 3, aka Ryzen 5000. We had Radeon 6000 RTX 30 series, PS5, Xbox Series X, all that good stuff. 2020 was the big year. The big year. Lots of stuff. Lots of electronics. It was a very expensive year. And it was also the pandemic. Get this out of here. This is not supposed to be here. So, that was 2020. So, the reason why I'm drawing this is to illustrate a point. I am someone who believes in the 3, 5, and 7 year principle, which means you can use a computer for minimum 3 years. After 3 years, if you want to upgrade, that is considered acceptable because you're at that 3-year cycle. Why do we use 3 years specifically? Because that is when the warranty on pretty much everything in that computer is expired. So you no longer have any warranty, which means if something breaks in your PC, you cannot get an RMA because it's no longer supported. It's out of warranty. So the 3-year mark is a good benchmark. So here we are, 3 years back. 1, 2, 3. So anybody with a computer that is from 2021 or older, if they're thinking about upgrading, they in order to justify the expense of upgrading, you ideally want your computer to be at least 3 years old because that indicates that you no longer have any warranty on any of the things in that computer. Assuming the computer has everything in it that has been built from 3 years ago. Not meaning you didn't upgrade, like your GPU or something last year or this year or whatever, because that doesn't count, because that's still new. Then there is the 5-year principle. So if somebody goes beyond 3 years, then they go to the 5-year. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, look. That's Ryzen 3000. The Ryzen 5 3600 is now almost 5.5 years old. Anyone on the 3950X, the 3800X, the 3700X, the 3600X, all of the Zen 2, aka Ryzen 3000, are now over 5. They're technically 5 years old. So that would be a good upgrade. If you, for whatever reason, still hold on to the hardware, then you go to the 7-year. So the 7-year would go back 2 more years. That means you would have a computer with a 1080 Ti and a first generation Ryzen. So like a Ryzen 7 1700 or a Ryzen 7 1800X or a Ryzen 5 1600X. You know, like those are 7-year-old parts with the GeForce GTX, not RTX, GTX 1080 Ti. That GPU is now 7.5 years old. Let's put things into perspective. The 1080 Ti and the first generation of Ryzen are the exact same age. That gives you an idea of how old one of the legendary GPUs is, as well as Zen 1. So that is old. If you have a computer that is 7 years old, that is considered the furthest back that I would consider hanging on to it. Meaning anything that reaches 7 years old when it comes to electronics, in this case we're talking about a desktop PC, that is definitely eligible for upgrade. That is more than eligible for upgrade. And really anything out there that's recent, that includes 9700X or the 9950X, heck, even Intel's new Core Ultra series, as flawed as that launch was, that's still going to be a world apart in terms of how much better that is compared to a Zen 1 CPU from 2017. So that gives you an idea. Anything, so I go as far back as 7 years. I operate on the 3, 5, and 7 year upgrade cycle. Anything older than 7 years is too old, and, you know, like that should be upgraded, ideally. So, but that's pretty much the principle. That's what I recommend people do. So the minimum would be like 3 years. So that brings us to 2021. And what launched at the end of 2020? Zen 3, which means Ryzen 5000. So that goes back to the original point about the 5800X. The 5800X is 4 years old. So technically, you're beyond the 3-year mark, but you're not at the 5-year mark. So anybody out there who has a Zen 3, so like a 5800X, a 5950X, any of those CPUs, if they upgrade now to a 9800X 3D or anything out there that's from this year, that would be a worthy upgrade. Anything older would be even better. So, but if it's more recent, then now it's questionable. Because so for example, let's clean some of this up here. Let's do this. So 2022, what launched in 2022? Zen 4, RTX 4090, the RDNA 3. So this was Radeon 7 7900 stuff, like that stuff launched. So this was 2 years ago. This is 2 years ago. So Ryzen 7000 is 2 years old. So technically, Ryzen 7000 is not, in my mind, is not eligible for upgrade because it's still too new to justify spending all that money to upgrade it. Now, here's the one thing, though, that I want to point out. The nice thing about the Zen 4 and the Zen 5, which launched this year. So this year we got Zen 5. So the nice thing about this is they share the same socket. They're both AM5. So even though, let's say, for instance, somebody is on a 7700X. The 7700X is an 8-core CPU that launched 2 years ago. So it was September of 2022. So it's a little more, it's like, what, 2 years and 2 months now? Or 2 years and 1 month, I should say. So it's, what is that, 25 months. It's 25 months old at this point. So technically speaking, I would not recommend upgrading to Zen 5 if you're on Zen 4 because it hasn't reached the 3-year mark yet. However, that's going to be up to you because if someone already has Zen 4, if they truly want to upgrade to the 9800X3D, for example, it's just a drop-in upgrade, which means they only have to buy the CPU. They can keep using their existing motherboard. So that is one of the benefits. That is a huge perk of being on the AM5 platform. Is it's basically, you got to think of it like you're subsidizing the cost of upgrades because you get to carry over the motherboard for multiple CPU generations. So that is actually a pretty nice incentive there. That is a very good, I guess what I would say is that is a good selling point for AMD's platform compared to their competitor. So technically speaking, Zen 4 is not old enough to justify an upgrade, but Zen 3 is old enough. So if you're on AM4, if you're on a DDR4, if you're on a DDR4 motherboard, you can totally upgrade to a 9800X3D and it's going to be good. That's the way I look at it. If you're on DDR5, then you truly have to decide, assuming you're on an AMD DDR5 platform, which would be Zen 4, you have to decide if you want to spend the money to do that drop-in socket upgrade. But if you're on Intel, it gets even harder to justify because, especially if you're on a DDR5 Intel, because if you bought into DDR5 on Intel early on, which would have been the tail end of 2021 or early 2022, you paid a lot of money for some low-end DDR5, assuming you actually bought DDR5, because most people that bought Intel's 12th gen, this was 11th and 12th gen, both were in 2021. One was in May, the other was in November, but Intel double launched that year because the 11th gen was such a disaster that they had to double launch. So because, damage control, reputation, salvation, whatever you want to call it, they had to fix the problem. So if you're someone who bought into DDR5 with Alder Lake back in literally almost 3 years ago, which means you're literally on the line for minimum eligibility for upgrade, at least in my mind, by the 3-year model. If you're on Alder Lake, technically, it is considered acceptable to consider upgrading to a 9800X3D because your computer has technically reached the 3-year mark. Now, here's the cool thing, though. If you actually bought DDR5 back in 2021 when it was like $800 for like 64 gigs of RAM or something, or like $500 for like a decent, like a 6432 gigabyte kit or whatever, or maybe it was like 5600. Back then it was terribly expensive and it was low end RAM. Like DDR4 was still faster than DDR5 at that time. But anyway, the point is, if you bought DDR5 in 2021 and you super overpaid, you can still carry that RAM over to your Zen 5 build. You can replace your Intel 12th gen with a 9800X3D and you can still use the same RAM. So that's the one interesting inference that I just figured out by talking through this. So it's like, yeah, if you have DDR5 from 3 years ago, even though it's probably some pretty trash DDR5 compared to the DDR5 that you can get now, you can still use it with the X3D. It'll work. It'll work totally fine. So, yeah, that's an option. Okay. What was the question? There was some question. Oh, I want to get 8,000 MTCU dim. QDIM, I don't know how much of a difference it's going to make, to be honest. I don't really think it's... See, the question in my mind is, does CUDIM help, like, lower the impact that the motherboard has? Like, if you have a high-end motherboard, I don't know if CUDIM actually matters. But CUDIM, if you can, like, for instance, if you can run 8000 CUDIM or QDIM on a 6-layer motherboard, then okay, then it helps. But if it doesn't help in that scenario, then it kind of defeats the purpose of having it. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not 100% sold on QDIM until I see some actual tangible benefits to it. Because if one thing I have looked at, like with, for instance, the Intel Core Ultra series, these CPUs, the QDIM, they can run QDIM, but it doesn't help because the latency is so bad. So it's like I don't see the point of it unless it helps in some tangible way. Okay. What X870E board do you recommend? That is a very broad question. You have to decide your use case. It's going to be based on the use case. Like, how are you going to use the computer? Like, that's the question. Because the thing about the motherboards is, yes, there's a tier list, but the tier list is not the be-all, end-all. You have to realize that certain motherboards are geared toward certain roles. Like, they do certain things better than other motherboards. That is the thing about the motherboards that it makes them all so different. Let's put it this way. Comparing motherboards is far more interesting and far more challenging to do compared to, like, comparing graphics cards. Because graphics cards are so cut and dry. It's like, how much money are you willing to spend on a graphics card? What monitor do you have? Are you going to get a new monitor? You know, what resolution are the games being played at? You know, like, that's really it. And then it's like, okay, well, which graphics card do you like the look of better? They all do the same thing. So it's not like a motherboard where a motherboard, I've said this before and I'll say it again. The motherboard ultimately determines what you can and cannot do with your computer. So the motherboard decision is a very important decision that is often overlooked. For example, not every motherboard will allow you to run DDR5 8000. A cheap or a lower end motherboard will not do this. So meaning if you cheap out on the motherboard, you instantly lock yourself out of being able to do like DDR5 8000, for example. See? So the motherboard is a very, very important choice when building a PC. It's the foundation. It determines ultimately what you can and cannot do with your computer. And that's just talking about RAM. We haven't even talked about, like, live streaming use case, because certain motherboards are way better at live streaming than others in ways that people don't even think about when they're buying a motherboard. So that's just another example. You know, what about gaming? Gaming, for the most part, they're all going to be the same. Like, they're all going to be able to do the same. They're like plus or minus 1%, -1 to +1%. It's so margin of error that it doesn't even matter. But it's like the other things that you're going to use the computer for. The motherboard plays a massive role in either enabling you or disabling you from doing certain things. MSI Tomahawk is limited. Yeah, I had a hard time getting. I can't get 8000 to work properly on the Tomahawk. $5930K is a Haswell E. That is an HEDT from the year 2014. So if somebody is on a $5930K, their computer is 10 years old and should be upgraded. I don't know where that came. I just saw someone mention 5930K. 5930K is on a platform called X99. It is an old, ancient, not quite a dinosaur yet, but it's pushing pretty close at this point. The speed at which technology changes, let's put it this way, computers age so much faster than organic beings. You know, unless we're talking about like flies or something that doesn't really have a very long lifespan, computers age pretty quick in the sense that technology moves so fast that a 10-year-old computer is really, really old.
Should I wait for 9950X3D if the only other thing I do apart from gaming is web browsing and Microsoft Word?
That's a good question. So really, you have to ask yourself, do you really ever see yourself using those extra threads, those extra cores and threads in the future? Because based off of what you said, like gaming and web browsing, an 8-core is more than enough for that. So 8-core, 16-thread, that's going to handle gaming. That's going to handle like any sort of Microsoft Office. It's overkill for Microsoft Office because all laptops can handle that. If you're doing like Excel with a lot of number crunching, the multi-thread sometimes helps in that, but we're talking about like a really, really big Monte Carlo simulation. So if you're not doing anything like that, then no, then there's not really much of a reason to wait. The only thing is we don't really know exactly what the 9950X3D will have. Like there's rumors out there saying that possibly both CCDs have 3D V-cache on them. Some rumors say that it's going to be similar to the 7950X3D, except it's going to have Zen 5 architecture. And now that we know that they've flipped the not the IO die. They've flipped the 3D cache that's underneath the CCD now, so we can assume that AMD is going to do the same thing with the dual CCD next year. So there's that, but I don't know. I would assume that the 9950X3D will probably have a better binned CCD, so that one will have higher clocks, boost clocks out of the gate stock versus the 9800X3D. I would assume that's the case because the fact that they're launching, well, it's kind of interesting because AMD is doing the reverse of what they did last time. So originally they launched the dual CCD first, and then they launched the single CCD second. This time around they're doing it backwards. They're launching the single CCD first, and they're launching the dual CCD second. So I don't know what that means because the dual CCD is typically going to be a more expensive product, which means it's a higher end segment, which means that it's going to have the better binned dies. This is no different from, the difference between like an i9 from Intel versus an i7. The i9 has the best binned die. So I would assume the Ryzen 9 will have the best binned die. So I can tell you, like, as somebody who literally has the 9700X and the 9950X, I can tell you the 9950X is faster in single thread performance because it has its first CCD boosts and clocks far higher than the single CCD on the 9700X. So I would assume the 9950X is going to get a better binned CCD compared to a 9800X3D. But, the way what you use your computer for, to me, sounds like the 9800X3D is fine. Like, I don't see much of a reason to wait. That being said, though, I know that you currently have the 7950X3D, which is still a monster CPU for both gaming and multi-threading. So, and it's not super old yet. So it's up to you. Like, the benefits of being on the AM5 socket is you can easily do a socket upgrade and keep the same motherboard. You have the Ace motherboard from MSI. You can just keep using that, and that's totally fine. Or you can just wait it out and see what happens with the 9950X3D. It's going to be a couple of months. I think it's going to come out around the time when Monster Hunter Wilds launches next year. So, you know, it's up to you. Technically speaking, though, I would say you're probably going to want to wait. If I were in your position, I would probably wait just because I'd be following my own advice, where technically the Zen 4 architecture is only in the 2-year block, so it's not really 3 years. So that's why it's kind of more of a wait and see approach. But appreciate the super chat. It's kind of crazy how X3D launches the same day as PS5 Pro. Yeah, we talked about that at the very beginning of the stream. That's going to make it hard to cover it because, like, at the same time, my original plan for the channel was to cover the PlayStation 5 Pro launch, but now this 9800X3D thing is just kind of crashing the party for everyone. They're crashing Intel's party. They're basically, like, overriding Zen 5's news, and they're now crashing the PS5 Pro's party. So it's kind of weird. It's just like, oh, it's just deciding to show up now. It's like Goku from Dragon Ball. Well, okay, no, we've already talked about who's who in the Dragon Ball Z universe. Basically, 9800X3D's Ultimate Gohan is basically like Ultimate Gohan arriving late to go and fight Super Buu. That is exactly what the 9800X3D is doing. If anyone's confused on what I just said, just ignore that last sentence, because if you didn't get the Dragon Ball Z reference, that's okay. Expect it together with what? I must return mine on December 25th. The what? How snappy do you think Windows will be and workload? I think it's going to be the same as Zen 5. It's not going to be any different from Zen 5. And Zen 5 is currently the fastest desktop processor. Hardware Unbox ran the Tomahawk at 8100. Okay, well, I mean, I don't know. You got to remember that they could have been using a different memory kit than me. But I've been using the same memory kit that has always worked at 8000 on my other motherboards. I didn't have any problems on those boards. But I couldn't get it to work on the Tomahawk that I was using. I mean, it works, but it's like not 100% stable. So it's not something that I would actually run. You had Strix, you started PC building in 2021, and you had the Strix 12900K and the Hero for the 79. Oh, so you had, okay. So you had a Z890 ROG Strix and an X670E Hero, Crosshair Hero, for the 7950X. Those CPUs are only 1 year apart in age. But the 12900K is now 3 years old, and the 7950X is now 2 years old. Now you're getting the X870E Strix and passing the X670E here. So you're passing the... Really? The X670E is the Hero is a very good board. Technically speaking, I would say that yeah, the new Strix is technically 1 tier lower in terms of Asus's product positioning. The Hero is a higher end product. So what's the reason for the Strix? Do you want the better heat sinks? Because the Strix has better heat sinks for M.2 drives than the Hero. The Hero's cool. The Hero has pretty lousy M.2 cooling compared to the Strix. You think it is worth the money upgrading from the i9 11900K? Well, remember, you got to remember what I said about the 3, 5, and 7 year life cycle. So you got to think about that. Objectively speaking, if you remove emotions or the desire to upgrade for the sake of upgrading and the sake of spending money on just having a new computer, if you remove that and you just look at it objectively, if we're looking at the 3, 5, and 7 year cycle, where does the 11th gen fall? You have to ask yourself, how old is the 11900K and where does it line up in terms of the upgrade life cycle? So here we are at the tail end of 2024. Zen 5 is the latest. We are in 2024. Soon we will be in 2025. So we're kind of like right here. 1, 2, 3. Now we've hit the 3-year life cycle. What was 3 years ago? The 12th gen Intel was November 2021. The 11th gen was around spring, or we'll say, I don't remember the exact date. I'm going to go ahead and say it was like April or May of 2021. So it is over 3 years old, which means the 11th gen falls into the minimum required life cycle of 3 years. So can you upgrade? The answer is yes, objectively, because all of the 11th gen stuff is out of warranty and no longer supported. Yeah, the 5930K is super old, man. You're gonna be like you're super CPU bound in like so many games. I can't even imagine what it would be like to run Dragon's Dogma 2 on a 5930K. That must be rough. That must be rough. I mean, that's DDR. Well, that is actually DDR4, but that's like the very first platform that supported DDR4. So that's like DDR4 2400 or 2666. At least you got quad channel memory, but you're so CPU bound on IPC core processing that, man, yeah, no, that's 5930K back in the day. That was like the ideal CPU for HEDT, but today, if you're on a fixed budget, would you spend more on 8000 DDR5 or a better motherboard with DDR5? Okay, that is an interesting comment. That's an interesting comment. But the comment doesn't take into account what was said earlier. So, there's a dichotomy with the comment about 8000 DDR5 or a better motherboard with DDR6000. So, okay, first of all, if you have a lower end motherboard, so if you're trying to save money so you can buy DDR5 8000, you cannot run DDR5 8000 on a low end motherboard. You have to buy a high end motherboard. You gotta move out of the way. I'm in the way here. Oh, I gotta move off the screen. You need a high-end motherboard. One of the cons of DDR5 8000 is you must have an expensive high-end motherboard. So if you want DDR5 8000, that automatically means you have to buy an expensive motherboard. You cannot buy DDR5 8000 then go buy a cheap motherboard like a B650 motherboard and expect it to work. It will not work. I'll tell you that right now. It just won't work. So you cannot take expensive RAM and put it with a cheap motherboard. That's not going to work. If you're going with high-end RAM, you have to also go with high-end motherboards. But that's a good question, because that is a good question to help educate people on these limitations and these requirements. So, if you want to save money on a motherboard, get DDR5 6000, because it works on any motherboard, even the cheapest motherboards. So that is a very good comment, though, because that question does help, because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people watching the stream that probably didn't even know that, or they didn't think about that. Okay. Is the Gigabyte X870 AORUS Elite motherboard good? You're going to be using it for gaming. So the X870 AORUS Elite is probably not going to be the best one for 8,000, but yeah, it's good. It's good for gaming and content creation, and you can run like DDR5 6000. You can run a lot of RAM. You can run like 192 gigabytes of RAM on there at like anywhere from like 4,800 to at least 5,200, if not 5,600. But you could probably do 5,600 at 192 gigabytes of RAM on the AORUS Elite. So, yeah, that's fine for that use case. I don't know, because I have not tested the Nova, so I can't answer that. If anybody has the Nova and they've tested 8,000, do let us know, because I'm also very curious to know about that. $256 gigabytes of RAM will be supported on all of them. It just depends on BIOS updates, guys. Keep in mind, there is currently no 256 gigabyte memory kit on consumer desktop. If you want 256 gigabytes of RAM, you have to go with Threadripper, because that only exists with RDIMM. You have to have registered DIMMs if you want that much RAM. It's another good question. Oh, that's a pretty good question too, though. Should I upgrade from the 7800 X3D for the new? Edgar, you're gonna have to decide. That's gonna be on you. Technically, that does not fall into what I said. Remember what I said. Your CPU needs to be 3, 5, or 7 years. The 7800 X3D is not even 2 years old yet. So technically speaking, if you're on a 7800 X3D, you're not eligible for upgrade. Now when I say that, that doesn't mean that you can't upgrade. You can totally upgrade if you really want to. But I'm just saying, objectively speaking, remove all the emotions from the desire to upgrade. Looking at things in a vacuum, like from outer space. If this is Earth and this is outer space and we're up here on the moon and we're like looking, if someone's looking, this is an eyeball, looking down at you on the planet Earth, you know, like here is North America, here's South America, over here Latin America, then you have the EU over here, Western Europe over there, then you have Africa down there. So, like, if someone's looking from space and they see the comment, if I have a 7800 X3D, should I upgrade to a 9800 X3D? The answer they'll tell you is no, you shouldn't, because it's too recent, objectively. But if you want to upgrade, you can. That's a decision you have to make. But if we do the life cycle, we are here 1.5. We're only at 1.5 years old on 7800 X3D, so it's not old enough. It's not even at the minimum of like 2 years. So it's probably not worth it. I'm actually glad I drew the timeline now, because, like, okay, here's the dark times. The dark times happened here, and then they went back to normal, like, there. This area, this section of history from the end of 2020 to the middle of 2022 was known as the dark times. This is the dark times. When the RTX 3060 Ti was $900. That's what I mean by the dark times. It was impossible to get hardware at decent prices. Unless you're buying SSD, well, even SSD, well, it was terrible. It was just a terrible time to be building PCs. Crucial T700? What about the Crucial T700? Robbie D, Crucial T700, what for? For a PC build? What was the question? I just saw the comment, Crucial T700. I was like, I don't know, what are we talking about? I mean, Crucial T700, I'm using one right now. It's great. It's fast. You just sold a 6950 Red Devil. Okay. Okay, so, you can run 4 sticks of RAM. You just have to wait for it to train. It'll take like 5 minutes or more the first time. So, if anybody wanting to run 4 sticks of RAM, I have lots and lots of videos on my YouTube channel showing how to run 4 sticks of DDR5. So, it can run. Every motherboard, let me repeat this. Every motherboard that has 4 slots for RAM can run 4 sticks of memory. Yes, you can. The Tomahawk can do it. I tested it. It works. You have to wait for it to train. If you sit there and you wait for 2 minutes and you're thinking that it's not working, that means you haven't waited long enough. You have to wait longer. We've shown this when I did the build video with the Crosshair Hero. It took several minutes to train 4 sticks of DDR5. So you have to wait. After it does the training, it won't be that long the subsequent times, but you have to wait. I don't know how much RAM you're trying to run, because the more RAM you're running, the longer it takes to train. No, it can run 4 sticks. Have you tried 4 sticks of RAM? Unless you have a defective motherboard, but you would be able to determine that based off of the code on the LED panel. The 7-segment display will tell you what the code is. Okay, so thermal right, HR10. What is this? People are just listing SSDs now? Is that the thing to do? What are we talking about? What speed? What? Got the Elite Ice? Okay, so the people are just listing off computer components. Yeah, that's okay. What was I gonna do? Oh, let's look at one of these motherboards that hasn't come out yet, but it is coming out soon because I've seen people starting to do unboxing videos, or not unboxing videos, but overview videos. So this motherboard from Gigabyte is coming out soon, real soon. The X870E AORUS XTREME AI top. This is an AI motherboard. This is the highest end Gigabyte motherboard that's launching real soon. So the reason why I'm mentioning this one is because there is very little info on this. And this motherboard does not, unlike a lot of Gigabyte's motherboards, at least the X870, X870E lineup from Gigabyte, all of their motherboards, except this one, have GPU lane sharing. This one, the best one they've got, does not have GPU lane sharing. Unless you want to run a second GPU in the second slot. That one uses 8 lanes from the primary so you can run dual GPU on this motherboard. But that's really the only thing, like, meaning you can populate every M.2 slot on the board and you don't have to worry about lane sharing. So this is one of the boards that's like that. There's not a whole lot that are like that, but this is one of them. That being said, I do want to point out again that the next generation of graphics cards will most likely be on PCIe Gen 5. So 8 lanes of PCIe Gen 5 is equal to 16 lanes of Gen 4 in terms of the bandwidth. So it's not like it's going to be that big of a deal, assuming you're on a Gen 5 GPU. So that's just, I wanted to point that out because, I've seen a lot of comments, particularly on the tier list video, about GPU lane sharing and how everybody wants to avoid GPU lane sharing. For the 40 series, for all the current GPUs, yeah, I can understand why you want to avoid GPU lane sharing, because there's always those random games that scale with PCIe, but there's not a lot of them. It's mostly the Sony games, like Spider-Man, Horizon. Those games scale with PCIe, so the less PCIe lanes you have, the lower the FPS is in those particular games. But most other games, they don't really have any difference in performance if you're running at X8 versus X16 on Gen 4. So I wanted to point that out because I got a lot of people commenting like, oh, well, I want a motherboard that avoids lanes, and everybody seems to think that the Nova is the only good motherboard because, first of all, the Nova is not the only motherboard that doesn't share lanes. All the ASRock boards don't share lanes. So the Taichi also, just saying, the Taichi's out there and it also doesn't share lanes. The Tomahawk from MSI also doesn't share lanes. And that is a single chipset motherboard. That's X870. That isn't even X870E. The Godlike from MSI also doesn't share lanes. And this Extreme AI top from Gigabyte also doesn't share lanes. So there are more motherboards than just the Nova that also don't share lanes. We're not talking about X670E. X670E, none of them, except for very, very few of them, but none of them shared lanes. The X670E Taichi does not share lanes. All the older motherboards don't share lanes. Let's put it that way. And the reason why the newer ones do, or are more likely to share lanes, is because of USB 4. We've talked about this in other live streams. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, because that's like another whole hour discussion right there on why the lane sharing is the way it is. But yeah, this board from Gigabyte is actually very nice. So this is a motherboard that has like everything that you don't even know that you need. Like, for example, it has a RGB Wi-Fi 7 320 megahertz antenna. So they have a RGB Wi-Fi 7 antenna. It's magnetic. On the back, they have a lot of 10 gig. There are no USB 2.0 and there are no 5 gig USB ports. Everything on here is 10 gig USB or USB 4 in the case of the dual 40 gigabit USB 4 ports there. Then there's HDMI, there's clear CMOS, and a bunch of USB. But here's the crazy thing about this. This is, because it's AI focused, is heavily focused on artificial intelligence. According to Gigabyte, in order for you to be hardcore serious about AI, if you're someone who cares about AI, they're going to give you a motherboard with not one, but two 10 gig Ethernet ports. This motherboard is the only flagship board that offers dual 10 gig networking plus the fast Wi-Fi 7. So that is something to note. And then it has optical audio and your standard like mic and line out, which also does support 5.1, but you have to do it in a weird way. The front panel audio is actually the DAC on this board. But yeah, that is the new flagship from Gigabyte for X870E. So kind of wanted to point this one out because we didn't get to cover this one when I've already done the tier list video, and this one was missing in action, so it was not included. But this one is actually really high end. The motherboard is insanely beautiful. Yeah, this is actually a full LCD screen. This is an infinity mirror screen display, similar to what is on the ASUS Extreme. The Taichi does have the external overclock. We looked at that when I did the build video on it. Yeah, there's the postcode, there's the memory. It has the reinforced memory for the 8000 sticks. It has that reinforced titanium ultra durable. They're calling it ultra durable PCIe armor for the second and the primary. So the primary and the secondary both have the reinforced titanium armor. So this is for dual GPU. So you would put, you know, like you would probably, I don't know if you would fit a second 4090 down here because this is kind of, I don't think it'll fit. It's too thick. But any of the dual, like for example, the professional graphics cards that use blower style cooling, you could put two of them in here easily. Now you wouldn't be able to use this bottom slot if you put a dual slot GPU down here, but technically you could run X8, X8 with dual GPU on this board. So I totally understand why they're calling it AI top, because only someone who's serious about AI, I mean, I guess if a gamer wanted this, it's like, yeah, you could technically use it for gaming and streaming, and it would be totally fine for that use case. But I feel like you don't have to buy the highest end board just for like gaming and even streaming. Like, this is really meant for someone who's going to be using it as a power user workstation. I say workstation, but I hesitate to call it a workstation because I don't consider standard Ryzen AM5 true workstation. That's not true high-end desktop. That would be Threadripper, which we've talked about previously, which Gigabyte does have an AI top Threadripper board, which is insane. It is like a wall in terms of how big it is, but yeah. You're buying the 9900X3D as soon as it drops. The X870E Strix and Hero is certified Dolby Atmos. You do 3D render with a lot of AI stuffs, and the 5600X plus 3060 Ti isn't enough anymore. Yeah, that PC sounds like a PC that was built during the dark times. I'm just saying. Zen 3 plus RTX 30 series, especially the 3060 Ti, sounds like something that was built during the dark times. Meaning 2021. That was the midst of the dark times. Thoughts on 9700X? I mean, I think it's fine. But I think because we're so close to the 9800X 3D, there really isn't a reason to get one. You just want to wait for the 9800X 3D. I mean, unless you don't really... Well, let's put it this way. So here's the thing. 9700X. This is a good point to bring up about 9700X. So the thing that a lot of people seem to not really think about or realize is that the resolution of your monitor determines ultimately whether or not your CPU or your GPU matters more. So if you're gaming at 1080p, for example, maybe in some cases 1440p, the CPU matters a lot more than if you're gaming at, say, 4K resolution. So if you're gaming at 4K resolution and you have a 9700X, and let's say on you have two computers side by side. One is on a 9700X, the other is on a 9800X 3D, and they're both gaming at 4K resolution. You would be assuming the GPU is the same in both systems, and the only difference is the two different CPUs. You would have a very hard time, if not, it would be impossible to tell the difference between the 9700X and the 9800X 3D, because at 4K resolution, you become GPU bound in almost every single scenario. So that is one thing to note. So if you're gaming at 4K resolution, the CPU doesn't matter as much as it does, or its role doesn't have as much impact while gaming compared to the GPU, or compared to if you were playing the game at a lower resolution. So that is something to note. So it's like, yeah, the 9800X 3D is the fastest gaming CPU, but if you're gaming at 4K, and if you get the 9700X instead, because it's going to be like 100 or more, it'll probably be like $150 less money than the 9800X 3D. So you're saving a lot of money if you go with a 9700X, and you can still overclock the 9700X, and it's low power. So it's like, for 4K, you can save $150 to get a 4K OLED. You know what I'm saying? So there's things like that. But the thing is, if you're gaming at 4K, you have to have a very high-end graphics card, either a 4080 Super or a 7900 XTX. Those are the two that I would consider like the minimum, and then you would either that or the 4090. So it's like, assuming you have one of those three GPUs, then you can save money on the CPU and get yourself a better monitor if you're wanting to game at 4K. So there's a lot of decision. I think of it like there's this decision tree that has like so many different permutations and like different paths that you can take, determining, or like it's based off of what you're building. Like, what's your ultimate gaming setup going to look like? What's the resolution of the monitor? That's probably the most important factor, to be honest, because that will determine like what CPU you can go with, what GPU you should have, things like that. And then the GPU will determine what kind of power supply you have, for instance. So it all just kind of like starts from what is the resolution that you're playing the game at, and and then you just go from there. The 4080 is weak at 4K. Yeah, it is kind of underwhelming at 4K. I don't know what it is about it. It just doesn't seem... There's something about it, because I was testing like Final Fantasy 16. The 4080 Super is very disappointing at 4K in Final Fantasy 16. The 7900 XTX does a lot better than the 4080 Super in that game at 4K. So it's, I don't know what it is about that card. It just doesn't seem... I mean, it's efficient, but it's like... it's kind of underwhelming at that resolution. 9950X is great, even for 1080p. QHD will do. 9950X is actually one of the best CPUs right now. Like, low-key... Like, just saying low-key, best CPU overall is probably 9950X. I mean, it's expensive, but it's really, really good. I mean, there's a reason why I'm using it right now as the live stream PC. Just saying. So, it's like everyone else is just kind of like arguing about, this CPU over here and that one and this one and Intel's one and this AMD one and that one and the 3D and this one. And meanwhile, I'm just sitting over here with like, I don't know what those people are arguing about, but okay, I'm just going to use 9950X. No, I'm not using a Nova. I don't have a Nova. I don't understand what this is about the Nova, guys. Like, everybody seems to think I have a Nova. No, we're not using a Nova. The Nova is super hard to find. First of all, it's always sold out, so you can't really get one. So, yeah. I don't know what to say. I don't have a Nova. It's that simple. You got the X870E Tai Chi. That is a good motherboard too. Yeah, that's a good one to match the 9800X3. That's actually a good one for 9800X3. Wondering if you should have went with a motherboard with AI overclocking, but like, no. The overclocking, the AI overclocking stuff is going to be a gimmick because it's going to be very conservative in terms of the values that it selects for you to use. So you're still going to end up having to manually, you're still going to get better results with manual overclocking anyway. The X870E Nova Phantom Gaming, the 7900 XTX Phantom are on the... Wait, what? On the 7th of October? That was like... What? 3.5 weeks ago? 4K is like 3D glasses? What? Not much out there yet. No, I wouldn't say that. I game on 4K. I've been gaming, so I've been enjoying gaming at 4K for 2 years now, guys. I made the jump to 4K in 2022, and I'm on an OLED now. 4K OLED, 240 hertz, 4K. That is like end game stuff right there. So, I wouldn't say that. You just have to have a high-end GPU, primarily. But you want to also have a good enough CPU that can feed the GPU, so that you're still GPU bound. Let's put it this way. You always want to be GPU bound. You never want to be CPU bound. It is worse to be CPU bound than to be GPU bound. If you're GPU bound, you're doing the right thing. Your system is working as intended. If you're CPU bound, that means you have an unbalanced PC build, and either the CPU is old or there's some kind of bottleneck, like the memory system is not set up correctly, or something's going on. Or it also could be the game itself is just really lousy and just creates a CPU bottleneck all the time. Case in point, Dragon's Dogma 2 is the most CPU bound game of the year. Like, you are literally always CPU bound if you're on a discrete GPU at the appropriate resolution for that GPU. You're GPU bound on the 4080. The 4080 is going to get GPU bound at 4K a lot, yes. I know this because I have one, and I game at 4K, so I know exactly what you're talking about. There's some conversation about, like, speaker systems or something. I don't know, like, that's... I don't know what's going on there. I just occasionally I see comments about, like, something that I don't know what was the discussion about, but, like, 4 subwoofers and 2 what 7500F placeholder until 9800X3D or 9950X3D. Will the 9950X3D have 3D cache in both? We don't know. The rumors are that it might be or it might not be, but no one actually knows. When is the Godlike for AMD releasing? Good question. I don't know. Probably within the next month. You don't need the 9800X3D because your kid is on 9600K and he will get the 5800X3D. Okay. 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 No, these are computer glasses. Yeah, these glasses block the blue light from the monitor. 2 dim ATX Apex thing. What? So, yeah, maybe, I don't know. Currently, the 2 dim board is from... Who has the 2 dim board? There's an Asus board. It's a Strix board that has 2 DIMMs. I forget which one. There's also the Gene. The X670E Gene, I believe. And then there was the ones from the last generation that had 2 DIMMs from, like, MSI and Gigabyte. 16 lane with the Nova motherboard is cool. Okay. The Asus Apex has 2 DIMMs. Yeah, Apex is the Intel one, guys. The Gene is the AMD one. I'm upgrading to 9800X3D from a 6-year-old 9900K. It's about time. Yeah, that is an old CPU at this point. Which one? Is it an STR? Which board? What is the best speaker series for 5.1 under? You're gonna have to ask one of the guys in the chat that's talking about that, because I don't know. I really don't know. What was I gonna do here? Somebody had asked me to draw like block diagrams for some of the boards. I know that this one's not published yet, so we might do this one, the Extreme AI Top from Gigabyte. The other one that was asked previously was the Intel-based motherboard from Asus. This one is called the ROG Maximus Hero. So this is the Intel version of the Crosshair. So Asus has 2 heroes. They have the Maximus Hero, which is the Intel version, and they have the Crosshair Hero, which we've already done a lot of videos on at this point, which is the AMD version of the same motherboard. So I guess we'll do the block diagram for this one and this one, or maybe we'll just do this one, and then if anybody has any questions on specific motherboards, we can also dig into that as well. If you're planning to build like a gaming, for anyone out there who's planning to build like a 9800X3D gaming PC next week or whatever, so we can do that instead. But I know like someone had asked me to do the block diagram for the Intel Hero board from Asus. It's kind of weird. We've been talking so much about 9800X3D. Now we're gonna like shift topics here, talking about Intel's Core Ultra series. So yeah, but there's this, and then there's this one. Here, we're gonna have to clean up Paint, because Paint has like all this stuff on it. How do I delete this thing? Oh. Okay. So we'll do the AI top. Let's do that. From Gigabyte. B&H has it listed. Which one? The AI top? Oh, but it's not actually available though, is it? Which one? You want which board? The AI top? Where is it? This? Okay. Okay, so the AI top. So how is this going to look? So first you gotta draw the socket. And then the chipset. Actually, you know what? Let's put this up here. So you have the AM5. Then you have the primary Promontory 21 chipset, and then you have the other one, the second Promontory 21. This is a dual. Then we have PCIe 5, PCIe 4, PCIe 3, PCIe 4, PCIe 3, and over on this other side would be like RAM and stuff, and then you have the interconnects of PCIe 4, connecting all of these. almost like a skeleton, like a spinal cord. So by this point, everybody who watches these videos knows that this is the LGA 1718, Android 17 and Android 18 from the Cell Saga or the Android Saga, and then we have Promontory 21, the first one, and Promontory 21, the second one. This is what distinguishes a X870E from an X870. An X870 doesn't actually an X870 doesn't have this. It only has this and this. But the lane count is pretty much standardized across the board. So you get PCIe Gen 5, 24 lanes directly hardwired into the CPU. And then off of the chipset, we get PCIe 4.0. We get 4 lanes off of this one. And then we get PCIe 3.0, 4 lanes here. And then down on the second chipset, we get PCIe 8 lanes. And here we get 4 more PCIe 3.0 lanes. So these are the chipset lanes. In here, this is 4 lanes of Gen 4. This is 4 lanes of Gen 4. So when people read stuff online and they're like, well, how come it says 28 total lanes? Well, when they say 28 Gen 5 lanes, they mean these lanes and these lanes. But you don't use these lanes because these are what interconnects to the chipset. Likewise, people are probably looking at this and they're like, well, how come the first chipset only has 4 and the second one has 8? Well, the reality is they have the same amount of lanes. You have to count them up. So, 4 plus 4 plus 4. That's 12. 12 Gen 4 lanes for the primary. 4 of them are uplink. 4 of them are downlink. These 4 downlink are the reason why this one only has 4 instead of 8, because the 4, it has to give 4 of the lanes to the downstream. See, that's why this guy only has 4 available, because what would have been 8, 4 of them are going down this way to the bottom chipset. The bottom chipset doesn't have something going down, so it gets to keep those 4 extra lanes, hence why it has 8 lanes. So they all have the same amount. So this motherboard, this is going to be, and this is not published anywhere online, so what you're about to see is like a world's first block diagram of the Gigabyte, well, this is actually, how do you call this? The Gigabyte X870E AORUS XTREME AI. How do they spell this? Is it all cap? AORUS Extreme with an X AI top. That's the name of the motherboard. Okay, so this motherboard on the CPU, it has 16 lanes that go to a splitter or a switch, a PLX switch, which will potentially divide the lanes across the first and second PCIe slot. So you have your X16, so your graphics card connects here. So we'll call this PCIe X16. And then the second one is called PCIe X8. So this is the top. This is the top slot. This is the second slot. So the combinations are you either have all the lanes to the GPU and nothing going to the second slot, or you have you have nothing in the second slot, so it'll be 0. Or you have, actually, whoops, what am I doing? It's never 0. That's not right. It's either going to be X16 or X8, meaning this first slot will either operate at 16 lanes or 8 lanes, depending on what is happening with the second slot. If the second slot is empty, it is operating at 0, not connected. So all 16 lanes are diverted to the GPU. If there is anything at all plugged into the second slot, it doesn't matter if it is a graphics card, if it is a sound card, if it is a 10 gigabit network card, which I don't see why anyone would need one of those because this thing has dual 10 gig, it will run at X8. Same thing with the graphics card. As soon as the second slot is activated, the graphics card runs at X8. Why? It gives half of this 16 to this guy so that he can work. That's how it works. So that is the main like PCIe 1 and PCIe 2 on here. Then the other thing that's on here is an M.2. So M.2, what do they call it? M2, what do they call this? M2A underscore CPU. That's the name. M.2 underscore, or M2A underscore CPU is what Gigabyte calls it. So this is 16. This is 4 lanes. So you do the math. What is this? 16 plus 4, that equals 20. That means there's 4 more lanes available. We all know, after looking at all these X870 motherboards, I think at this point everybody knows what the last 4 lanes go to. They go to the ASM 4242. The ASMedia USB 4 chipset, which allows dual 40 gigabit USB 4 on the back of the motherboard. That is how you get USB 4. That's taking up 4 lanes of potentially Gen 5 bandwidth. So that is a lot of bandwidth for just 2 USB 4 ports. So that takes care of all of the CPU lanes. So 16 plus 4 is 24. Everything is there. And then the total lane would be 28 if you include the downlink to the chipset. Why is there no chipset for Gen 5 SSDs? Why would you need a chipset for Gen 5 SSDs? This is a Gen 5 SSD slot, if that's what you're asking. This is anything that connects here can be up to Gen 5. To split. There are actually some motherboards that do that. Now, they're not doing that for Gen 5, but I'll tell you, one of them that does it is the Tomahawk. The Tomahawk does what you're saying. The X870 Tomahawk splits the Gen 5, takes 4 Gen 5 lanes, shares them between the ASM and a second Gen 5 SSD. So some of them do that. The Godlike from MSI also does what you're saying. But the thing is, Gen 5 SSDs run very hot. They're hard to cool. So you have to have really good cooling if you're going to use them. So you want to keep that in mind. Okay, now moving on to the primary chipset. So this one only has the 4 lanes, but what they've done here is really interesting. So they have 2 devices that they've connected that each use 2 lanes. 2 lanes for this, 2 lanes for that. 2 lanes to a splitter again. Or they actually, it's not a splitter, it's a switch. So they're using a switch that takes 2 lanes, and it's going to be divided between 2 devices. One is going to be M2B underscore SB, which means chipset. SB stands for South Bridge. This is the South Bridge. This is the SoC, also known as System on Chip, which is the North Bridge. So think of this as North Bridge connectivity and South Bridge connectivity. But they don't use North Bridge as a terminology anymore, so they'll just say CPU. And I just deleted that thing. Oh, wow. Oops. Oh, well. So M2B underscore SB. And the other thing that connects here is a PCIe X2 slot. So the bottom PCIe slot on this motherboard is an X2 Gen 4 PCIe slot, which shares with one of the Gen 4 M.2 slots. So then the last thing here, this is going to be one of the 2 10 gig LAN. And then over here on PCIe 3, they're doing 4 SATA ports. They're taking 1 lane of Gen 3 and they're converting it to 1 SATA interface per device. So they literally have a bunch of SATA devices here. So this is going to be SATA or SATA 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's what this is. So all the SATA connects there. Okay, so that takes care of that. So we got one of the 10 gigs. We've got PCIe X2. We got another M.2. All right, so that leaves the bottom of the motherboard. It's the second chipset now. Oh, also, this is, well, you know, this is like all the lanes. So this is like X1, 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 like that. So all 4 of these are used up for the SATA. And then 2 for this, and 2 for that. So that equals 4. Okay, now the bottom chipset. So this one, this is very easy, this last part. So right here, what they have done is they basically put 2 M.2s. Is that, what is this? Ansbert P just subscribed. Thanks for the sub. So M2, I think M2B. Oh, you know what? I think I named that one wrong. M2B underscore SB. Or maybe it was M2C. I forget. It would be on the product page. M2D underscore SB. So this one might be M2E or something. I think this one's M2E. There. And these are 4 lanes each. So 4 and 4. So all 8 lanes are taken up, so that's good. And then over here on the last part of this, they have 2 and 2 here. So they got 2 and 2, and then what they've done is here they have a second 10 gig LAN, and then the last thing they put was a Wi-Fi 7. And this is the higher end 320 megahertz Wi-Fi 7. So that's what they've connected on the remaining lanes for the PCIe 3. So they got 10 gig, which is 2 lanes here, and 10 gig, which is 2 lanes there. So I feel like if they could have done anything differently, I feel like they could have done something a little bit more different over here. Honestly, the dual 10 gig is really weird. they could have done, like, on this guy, or maybe on this guy, instead of doing a second 10 gig, they could have done like a 5 gig, which would have only taken one lane. And then they could have either put a PCIe X1 slot for a sound card or something. Like, they could have just done something a little bit different to change it up a little bit more. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's okay with what they did. I personally feel like this is kind of not good. I would have rather, instead of a second 10 gig, they could have done an X4 PCIe or an M.2 over here. Or instead of doing the splitter or the switch, they could have done 2 lanes to this and permanent 2 lanes to that instead of having to share them. So this second 10 gig is kind of a strange choice. I don't really agree with it. I feel like I would have preferred a motherboard that had a single 10 gig and a 5 gig instead of dual 10 gig. But, you know, whatever. They're doing dual 10 gig because of the AI top or whatever. So that's what Gigabyte came up with. So this is the Gigabyte Aorus. This is the X870E AORUS XTREME AI top. This is probably one of the more useful Gigabyte motherboards that doesn't have any GPU lane sharing for M.2 drives. That being said, this is their flagship board and it has like dual 10 gigs. So the dual 10 gig is very, very niche. So I don't know how many people actually need dual 10 gig. Because only a few people really need single 10 gig, if that makes sense. So really, really strange. I would have rather have seen an X4 slot here instead, to be honest. But anyway, that's what they decided to do. So the nice thing is, you know, you have your Gen 5 SSD, you have a Gen 3, you have a Gen 4, and you have 2 more Gen 4. So for M.2, if you wanted to add more storage, you could get a PCIe add-in card to add 2 more Gen 5 SSDs off of the PCIe X8 slot. But then the GPU will run at X8. So that is something. So you could drive a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can do six M.2 drives on this motherboard, assuming you have an add-in card. So you could do 3 Gen 5 and 3 Gen 4. So this is hence why they're calling this AI top. But I think if someone's going to be doing AI top or AI on this board, they're more concerned with dual GPU. So GPU 1 and GPU 2, maybe GPU 3, although that's very, very unlikely, considering this is directly underneath the second slot. So it's going to be covered up, most likely. But, you know, 4 M.2s, 3 Gen 4, 1 Gen 5, dual USB 4 with DisplayPort Alt of integrated graphics, but the dual GPU is the main selling point here. So or the main use case for AI with a dual 10 gig. So kind of a niche motherboard, but it is an interesting one. It's certainly a more interesting one to look at. So, oh, where is all the USB? So we don't talk about USB because there's so many of them. USB is going to connect here, here, and here. Typically the way and the onboard audio connects here, usually. Gigabyte connects it directly to the CPU. If you're talking about the analog audio and the front panel audio, they go on the CPU. The USB, some of the USB on the back of the motherboard connects directly to the CPU. Some of the USB on the back of the motherboard also connect to the primary chipset. The rest of the USB that goes on the front panel header typically connects to the second chipset down here. So the reason why I skip over USB is because there's a lot of them and it gets really, really messy if we draw them. They do not connect to PCIe. USB connects on its own serial interface. There's not even serial. It just connects on its own universal serial bus interface. So the chipset has the ports Think of it like a switch. It's got switch ports on the CPU for USB devices. And the same thing with these chipsets. They also have USB interfaces directly on them. So that's how the USB connects. That's a good question, though. I don't think anyone's asked that before. But a couple years back when we covered X670, I did draw some of the diagrams with the USB. It's super messy to include the USB. That's why I don't do it. And then over here, you know, if we really want to complete it, you have your dual channel RAM. So, you know, you have DDR5 channel A, and then you have DDR5 channel B, and you know, you have 4 DIMMs, so you've got A1, A2, B1, B2. That's your RAM. If we wanted to complete the whole thing and show that, I mean, that's where the RAM goes. So the memory plugs in to the socket on the I/O die. In fact, everything that we're drawing here, we might as well call this the I/O die, because this is the I/O die where every PCIe device connects, as well as the USB. Yeah, USB 4 is basically Thunderbolt 3/Thunderbolt 4. Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4 are effectively the same thing. They're both 40 gigabit. There's really no difference. The main difference is Thunderbolt 4 introduced some UEFI security features that did not exist on Thunderbolt 3. That's really the only difference. So other than that, they're the same thing. Yeah. The Tomahawk is doing something with this, though. The Tomahawk basically has lane sharing right here. They give you another Gen 5 M.2, like kind of like wedged in here. That's how the Tomahawk does it. What's the best to run 2 or 4? What? Oh, sticks. What's best to run 2 or 4 sticks at 8,000? You want a high-end motherboard. At the very minimum, you want an 8-layer motherboard. Who wants what? Who wants to tell that one that Thunderbolt is and was on many AMD boards? Thunderbolt is on, as long as it has the... So as long as the cards, you're talking about the Thunderbolt add-in cards for like X670 and X570 and all the older boards. Yeah, as long as the add-in card for that vendor is supported on the motherboard, it does work. The Thunderbolt I guess you're talking about Thunderbolt add-in cards. Those were for X670E and B650E. There was several of them, and then obviously Z890. They do support the PCI tunneling though, so they basically do function with Thunderbolt. ASRock have Thunderbolt on almost all the AMD. Yeah, and it is full Thunderbolt. That is true. So, okay, here's the thing, guys, about Thunderbolt. I've already done a video about that. We're not going to talk too much about this subject, but the bottom line is Thunderbolt works on AMD provided that the motherboard certified it to work on AMD. Case in point, the ASRock, if you guys look on my YouTube channel, you will see there are multiple videos on the channel showing Thunderbolt on AMD. And it's full Thunderbolt. We're not talking about USB 4, we're talking about Thunderbolt 4. I have Thunderbolt 4 running on an X670E ASRock Steel Legend using ASRock's Thunderbolt card. I show all the steps, all the Thunderbolt menu items, where to enable it in the AMD Common BIOS settings. It's all there. We've done Gigabyte as well, using Gigabyte's. I've done 2 different ones. I've done the Maple Ridge 2 years ago, so we did that. That's Thunderbolt 4 on an X670E AORUS Master. The Titan Ridge is the Thunderbolt 3 card. That one also works, but that's Thunderbolt 3. And then, what was the other one? Oh, Asus as well. So it's like, yeah, it just kind of depends on whether or not the motherboard manufacturer added support for the Thunderbolt card on the AMD board. That's all there is to it. So it does work. You just have to have a motherboard that supports it. So here, let's do one thing here. What was the ASRock one? Well, let's just do Gigabyte. No, not Gigabyte. ASRock Thunderbolt 4 AIC. So here is the ASRock one. Thunderbolt 4 AIC. This is the card that I did the video on. This was a video that's on the channel from last year. So, and then we go to the support page. Then we go to the support list. And then here we have AM5. Let's zoom in a bit. So, okay, obviously Thunderbolt Intel. So, there's going to be Intel boards. So, AMD X670, Steel Legend. This is the exact motherboard that I did the video on. The PG Lightning also. And then the B650. There's a bunch of B650 boards. And then you go further back. Then it gets a little bit more iffy because AM4 was like way older. So, but it's only those. And then Gigabyte, similarly, and Asus have similar support lists. So you really just have to go and look at whether or not the motherboard supports it. So, but the thing is, here's the thing. Like, fast forward to now, we have X870 and X870E. Those have USB 4 via ASM 4242, and the new AS Media chipset has more bidirectional throughput than the old Intel JHL 8540, because the Intel JHL 8540, which is the Thunderbolt 4 chipset from Intel, this thing uses 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 3. Gen 3. The ASM 4242 from ASMedia uses 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 4. So the latency and the bandwidth throughput, you have lower latency and you have more bandwidth throughput with the newer USB 4 than you have on the older Thunderbolt 4 chipset. So that is one thing that at the end of the day, I've already tested. In fact, I already use my Thunderbolt capture card, my Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4 capture card from AverMedia. I have been using it now with the X870E Crosshair Hero from Asus. And it works totally fine to live stream, for instance, Monster Hunter Wilds. All those streams that you guys saw me the last 2 nights featuring Monster Hunter Wilds, you know how I was streaming that? Thunderbolt 3 capture card on an AMD X870E USB 4 interface. So that proves that it works the same way because it has something called PCIe tunneling. I have another video on the channel, I believe. I'm trying to remember what the video was. There was a video that was uploaded, I think last month, that covered the USB 4. I think it's Live Gamer Bolt on USB 4 on the Crosshair Hero. So check out that if you're more curious to investigate this topic specifically, because this is something that it's kind of a niche thing, but it's really only relevant for content creation, really. Most likely people are just going to use like any random USB or internal capture card, and then this is kind of irrelevant. But anyway, guys, that's probably going to be it for this stream. Yeah, that's all I had. So that's the block diagram for the Extreme AI top. But anyway, we'll be back next week. So next Thursday, we will probably be talking about the PlayStation. It's going to be two topics: PlayStation 5 Pro, and obviously the 9800X 3D. So stay tuned for that. If you're new to the channel and you just subscribed, thank you for subscribing. I'm assuming you guys are into like PC DIY and you're building PCs and that kind of thing, or you're thinking of doing an upgrade. But that's what we do. We pretty much talk about this stuff all the time on this channel. So if you have any questions, it is best to ask the questions while we're doing the live stream, because that way, depending on the topic, it could get addressed using Paint, and then it's illustrated, and then it's something you can refer to in the future. So anyway, guys, that's going to be it for this stream. Thank you for tuning in. Do get subscribed if you're not subscribed and you like this sort of in-depth content, because it's kind of a unique thing that we do on this channel, and we do it every Thursdays at the same time. So thanks for tuning in, and I will catch you guys next Thursday on the next episode of Tech Thursdays. Until then, take care, and I'll see you then. Thanks.